Snow had a hush that belonged only to winter evenings on the frontier, a pressed, crystalline silence that held both the hollowness of empty places and the small, tender possibility of shelter. It lay over the station at San Luis like a smooth cloth, covering tracks and sleepers and the single oil lamp that guttered by the ticket window. Maria Campbell folded her thin shawl tighter around the shape of a life carried in a battered suitcase and tried to make herself as small as the night would allow. She had a name, she had hands that knew how to sew and mend, and she had a letter in her pocket that once promised arrival and then became nothing but a ragged scrap of paper when the train let her down and went on. If you would stay to the end of Maria's story, please consider subscribing and liking. These frontier tales keep finding their way to new listeners because people choose to keep them alive. The sleigh bells that were not there seemed at first only the dream of heat within her bones. The wind carried the faint smell of wood smoke from a distant homestead and the metallic tang of iron rails. Snow came down in a slow curtain. Each flake landed on her eyelashes and melted there, leaving a cool sting. The platform was an island of yellow lamp glow in a sea of gray. A single bench sagged under a crust of snow where somebody had once waited and then left. Maria's suitcase had a rip at one corner, a seam where her mother had stitched it twice over. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay the small tools of her trade. A needle, a thimble, a scrap of gingham, a spool of thread that still smelled faintly of lavender. People passed by her life like trains. Once there had been a man with steady hands and a voice that promised a future in town. Dr. William Harris's letter had been careful, ink small and exact about prospects and respectability. He had written of a job, of a quiet room above his clinic, of introductions to the right families. He had written the kind of sentences that made a woman fold herself into them. The letter had promised safety, but safety was a house with drawn shutters if there was no warmth inside. When the carriage that was meant to meet her did not arrive, and the station master shrugged his shoulders and told her the last coach had gone on, the world shrank until there was only the suitcase, the cold, and a sound like an animal whimpering deep in her chest. She did not expect anyone to come. No one had come at the stop where her train had thinned out of steam and left her with the scent of coal and the taste of iron. The town that William had described in that careful script was half a day's ride away. Respectable, prim, patrolled. On a night like this, who liked their marriages ordered and their mistakes hidden. On a night like this, no respectable face would step out into storm and find a stranger on a platform. Then the sound came, not the far-off rumble of another train, but the soft sob of hooves on a snow-crusted road. Footfalls could be hushed by the weather. A man arriving on horseback made another sort of sound, a muted thump and creak. The horse's breath traced white against the dark. A figure in a broad-brimmed hat rode close enough to make out the set of shoulders beneath a heavy coat. The rider halted, reins slack, and blinked against the fall. He saw the lamp, then the suitcase, then Maria's face, pale as unbaked dough. He dismounted as if there was nothing dramatic in doing so, every movement deliberate and quick. He left the animal to stamp its feet and snort steam. Up close, his face was weathered but not hard. There were lines at the eyes from long sun, and more from steady laughter than worry. He carried the kind of quiet that seemed to have been shaped by work with hands and the habit of not wasting words. "You shouldn't be out here tonight," he said, voice low as though the weather deserved courtesy. Maria looked at him for a long moment before answering. The temptation to say she was fine and that a letter had misled her lay in her mouth like bitter bread. Pride whispered to tuck her chin and nod, to let him ride on. She could have, perhaps, found a bench and waited for daylight. But cold sharpens the truth. "No," she said, the single word a piece of honest skin. I was left." He stepped closer. Near enough, Maria could notice the smell of tack oil and horses, of old leather, and the sharp note of peppermint that meant someone kept a tin by his coat. His hands were large and sure. Calluses crossed the broad part of his palm. "I'm Charlie Davis," he said, and offered one of those hands, the way one offers a bridge. "You from San Luis?" "Nobody's ever left me before," she said, and then, ashamed of having said it aloud, pulled the shawl tighter. She did not mean to beg. She was simply saying what had been true since childhood, that being left was an ache she knew like the inside of a seam. Charlie's laugh was the sound of a man with few illusions. "Not how you're meant to start a Christmas Eve," he said. "Come on." He took her suitcase with a grip that did not crush and led the way along the platform, past the ticket window, toward the lane where a rutted wagon road disappeared into a shadow of pines. As they walked, the station's lamp faded behind them, and the world contracted to two travelers and a horse. The ride to the ranch was the sort of journey where the country speaks in small things. Snowfields rolled and broke across the plain. A line of distant spruce bent under the weight of whiteness. Charlie rode his horse as if he and the animal were two halves of the same steady thing. He did not offer much in the way of questions at first. He steered her away from the main road and into a path that protective trees made. The ranch that emerged from the snow was modest against the sky. A low house of boards, smoke curling from the stovepipe, and a nearby stable that smelled of straw and the other quiet life of animals. A light in the window glowed like a promise. Charlie brought the horse up before a porch and led Maria down the steps with the gentleness of someone who had learned how to lift a body without alarming it. He did not ask her name again after she offered it. Some things are offered once, and that is enough. Inside the house, the stove held a depth of heat that first seemed impossible. It gave off the grainy, insistent warmth that only wood will, and with the heat came the smell of broth, and a laundry hung near the rafters to dry. A woman's sewing was scattered on a small table, and a basket of thread and buttons suggested other hands. The house belonged to simplicity. A table scarred by use, a shelf of jars and tins, a chair with a patch on one arm. A child's toy, a carved horse, lay by the hearth. Home here was not a showpiece. It was an instrument for living. "You'll be wanting a cart of blankets on you," Charlie said, and fetched one from the trunk that sat by the door. "No use letting you freeze." Maria allowed him to wrap the warmth around her like contrite absolution. She felt ridiculous for thinking she could hold such a fragile dignity alone. Her cheeks were wet from the cold, but she did not want pity. Charlie's attention was practical, not pitying. He moved about the room with the focused efficiency of someone who had long since learned the ardor of keeping a place through the seasons. "You can sleep on the settee," he told her, "and I'll set you up with a bowl of stew. Marnin', we'll sort what you want to do." He said it as if offering a plan, not as if passing judgment. The steadiness of his voice soothed something tight inside her. The first night at the ranch passed in odd fragments. Sleep came and left. Maria lay with the blanket pulled up to her chin and listened to the soft domestic noises, the tick of the stove, the creak of settling boards, the occasional lowing of a cow from out in the lot. She thought of William's neat letter, of the strange flattening feeling of being promised a future by someone who wrote in careful hand. She thought, too, of her mother's hands, of the way a button would sit in the palm as a small thing of value, how a mended sleeve could change the way a person carried herself. There are remedies the world gives that are not loud. In the morning, Charlie was already at the stable, leading a bay mare through the cold. He moved with such competence that Maria could not help but watch. Each task had a small choreography. He fed the horses, checked the harnesses, and seemed to know when to speak and when to be silent. He showed her where the mending basket lived in the corner, and asked, simply, if she could stitch a tear in a saddle blanket. The request was work, nothing more, and yet it was the kind of offer that carried a quiet welcome. Days at the ranch settled into a rhythm. Chores, meals, small talk stretched into confidences measured in honest deeds. Maria mended by lamplight, the needle glinting like a small second sun. Charlie sat by the door after supper, whittling a bit of wood into a peg, and sometimes he would look at her as if he were weighing how much of himself he had to offer in the world. He spoke of nothing grand. He told stories of a mare that once tried to jump a fence and failed only because she was frightened, of a neighbor who taught him how to splice a broken rein by candlelight. Those stories were the kind that lay out a man's hands. He asked about her trade, about seams that frayed and hems that needed reinforcement. She told him about the seamstress's eye, the way a garment wore truth or lied with flattery. "A dress can make a woman walk as if she owns the room," she said once, watching her stitch. Her voice carried no vanity. It carried a fact. "Maybe that's what you should be doing in San Luis," Charlie said. "Not sewing what other people need to wear to be happy, but sewing something that makes you glad to wear it yourself." His words were simple, but edged with care. They landed in her thought like a stitch in a raw place. It was not the sort of sentiment that meant to sweep a person off their feet. It was the sort of thing that offered a place to stay when a footstep faltered. At the stable, too, small intimacies took shape. He taught her how to read a horse's mood in the tilt of an ear. She showed him how to thread the needle so the spool did not knot. They ate from the same pot, passing a plate back and forth until their hands learned a rhythm of mutual service. Maria found herself humming while she worked, short songs her mother used to hum. The familiarity of the days was a soft constriction, something like safety, but not yet called by that name. News of any kind moved through San Luis like a slow current. Charlie rode into town sometimes to trade a hide, to sell butter, or just to fetch the mail. He came back with bundles and the occasional gossip of the baker's wife, who had come into money, who wore what, and who had been seen in company with whom. The town held itself to the measure of appearances. Reputation was counted in the cut of a coat and the color of ribbons. For all its smallness, San Luis had the same hunger for stories that all towns do. It was in that quiet that William returned. The news came as a telegram first, a small square of paper that smelled of the ink used in offices and the faint ozone of telegraph wires. It arrived at the post with a polite clerk's hand and then found its way to the ranch through Charlie's slow, thoughtful gait. Charlie read it by the door, thumb tracing the crease, and for the first time Maria saw a shadow cross his face that was not the winter's weight. "He's coming," Charlie said, setting the paper on the table as if to measure it. He did not need to add whom. The winter light made a soft halo around the ink. Maria felt as if something had shifted under the floorboards. The idea of William's crisp shoes stepping across Charlie's worn plank floors brought an image she could not welcome. When William arrived, he arrived like an argument. He came with a carriage polished to a sheen and the exactness of someone used to being perceived a certain way. He had dressed as if for a portrait, a dark coat cut to show shoulders, a scarf neatly tied, a hat carried rather than worn. He carried that careful air as if it were a thing he had earned and therefore had the right to hold. He greeted Maria with a manner that had been folded into his letter. He did not seem surprised to find her warm, but he carried a thin impatience at the lack of show. He looked about the room with a polite, disapproving eye, cataloguing the cracked paint and the bowls on the hearth. "I had thought," he said at last, "that Miss Campbell would have found proper accommodations by now." There was a civility to him, but it was the civility of a polished blade. His politeness was the sort that made one feel the edge under the smile. He spoke of introductions and opportunities in town with the steady precision of someone who had never had to stay and watch stew bubble over a wood stove. Offered Maria a place, a room over his office. But his attention always wandered toward how she would be seen there rather than how she would be at rest. Maria listened to him and felt herself rearrange into the posture he expected, proper, grateful, prudent. For a time, his company felt like a guardianship. There was a clear, calculable future with him. He would offer introductions to the right families, and there would be a proper wedding, neat announcements, hands shaken by well-dressed neighbors. The allure of that sort of life tugged at the loneliness inside her. There is a hunger in being made decent that can taste like love when one is cold. But William, when he thought himself slighted, showed his teeth. At dinner one evening in the town, when a neighbor's comment was misread as an affront, he bristled. His patience was thin as paper under a boot. The test of his character came in short, sharp moments. The way he smoothed a cuff when a maid was clumsy. The way his jaw tightened when someone laughed at his expense. Maria liked the embroidery of his sentences, but she began to notice how every disagreement left him looking for dominance rather than repair. The confrontation in his clinic did not start as a battle. It started as a dismissal, a town's whisper taken for a public thing. Maria accompanied William to speak with a woman who sought treatment. She stood quietly by, hands clasped. William's clinical voice was measured, yet when a neighbor raised a question about Maria's abrupt arrival days earlier, there was a small, sharp change. The neighbor's tone carried a casual cruelty masked as curiosity. The room's air, warmed by the oil lamp and the scent of medicinal spirits, seemed to narrow. "You came here as if you had nowhere else to go," the neighbor said. A statement slipped like a sardonic gift. Maria felt the room tilt. Faces pressed in. She imagined the letter in her pocket as a thing that could be unfolded and judged. Her cheeks warmed with the small, familiar burn of shame. It was the pulse of everyone's attention that sharpened the feeling into an ache. William's jaw flattened. His politeness thinned. "This is no matter for commentary," he said. His voice held the faintest tremor, not fear, but indignation. The neighbor laughed, the sound bright and cruel in the lamplight. William's hand moved. It was the sort of move that startled because it was not premeditated. It was quick, one fall of a glove. Then it was done, a single punch, a brief collision of flesh and surprise, and a man folded into the indignity of being struck. The punch landed on someone else, the neighbor, not Maria, and the suddenness of it made every head turn. It was brief, non-graphic, and terrible in its finality. The room held its breath as if waiting for a bell to toll. Silence after such a thing has a weight. Maria's hands tightened in her lap. For a moment she considered saying something that would excuse him for the sake of what he represented. But the truth had a tidy clarity. The man who struck when provoked did so because he could not stand the small disorder of being undermined in public. It was a thing that told her more than his exact words ever had. After the incident, people in San Luis had conversations that sound like a stitch pulled loose, small, sharp, and revealing the dark. Conversations are made shapes by what they choose to dwell on. They spoke of William's temper and of how irregularities among the classes were to be tolerated, not made scandalous. For Maria, each whisper carried the old weight of being set aside. For the first time in weeks, the steady life at the ranch showed itself as a place where someone's hands would smooth a frayed collar rather than appraise its worth. There came a day, not long after, when Maria let the glitter of safety draw her toward the town. William had asked her to accompany him to a gathering where introductions would be made and a respectable life might be stitched together. For one aching hour, she allowed herself the certainty of being looked after. William's pride flattered and frightened her. His promises were practical and precise, and for a woman who had stood on a snowbound platform at the edge of midnight, those were rare gifts. But certainty, when it is purchased with the cost of being invisible, does not satisfy. Maria found that in the parlor's genteel shadows she could not breathe as freely as she had while mending by the stove. The laughter there was neat, folded into a fabric she did not fit. At night, in the room above William's clinic, she turned in the bed and felt like a borrowed thing. Here, the pillow smelled faintly of the mint William used in his pocket, and the curtains were marine enough to show care. Yet there was a coldness in his way of looking at her that had nothing to do with the weather. One morning, under the strain of a conscience that had tightened like a wire, she rose before light. She packed what few belongings she could without making a scene: the sewing tools wrapped in oilcloth, a spare shift, the little carved horse that someone on the ranch must have left behind, and left a note that said little and everything she could not have said facing him. It was a departure that had nothing of drama. It was the steady course of a woman choosing the sound of her own name over a life arranged by others. The journey back to the ranch was an inward unraveling and a mending at once. She rode in a slow, solitary carriage, the winter landscape blurred by the window. The miles were long enough to give thought space to become action. The memory of Charlie's hands on the saddle, the quiet of his laugh, the steadiness of his regard when she spoke of little things like the right way to lay a hem. She felt the pull of what had been simple and true. When she arrived, Charlie met her at the corral. If he had always expected her to come around. There was no triumph in his eyes, only a compassion so steady that it could be leaned on. She did not fall into him with dramatic weeping. Instead, she stood in the snow and watched him approach, feeling the honesty of his presence as a warmer thing than any promise of a parlor wedding. He did not demand an explanation. He offered work, and then, in a quieter hour, the conversation that laid out the truth between them. "I was foolish," she said finally, and it surprised her that the words felt like a seam being straightened. "I wanted to be fixed. I thought he could fix me." "We're not something to be fixed," Charlie said. His voice held the simple conviction of someone who had lived enough to know that people are things we walk alongside, not things we press into shape to fit an expectation. "You're not a mending project. You're a person." Maria let out a breath she had kept folded to herself. The silence that followed was not emptiness. It was the quiet of two things settling into an honest pattern. The ranch, with its creek and warmth and stray hay, had the comfortable truth of a life in which hands are used and not displayed. Charlie's love was not a lantern hung for show, it was a hearth. Winter thawed, as it always does, into a slow green of days that brought work back into the fields and a sense of time that was less urgent, more patient. Maria found that she could stitch with a freer hand, hum as she worked, and laugh at the small jokes about collars and buttons. She and Charlie worked as if they were composing a life with steady tools, building a fence, mending a roof, teaching a young colt to bear the saddle. The marriage that would come months later was not an event that arrived fully formed. It was a steady accumulation of small certainties. When they married in the spring, the town turned out not because of the grandeur of the ceremony, but because people are drawn to celebrations of plain goodness. There was a simple gathering in the church at the edge of San Luis. The wood benches smelled of polish and flowers, and neighbors came bearing pies and stories. William's name was not on many tongues. The town had a memory for a man who hits and then expects silence. Charlie and Maria's wedding was a modest affair. A ring, a promise, a pressed dress Maria had made herself for the day, her fingers steady as she stitched the last hem. Months later, in a small house warmed by a stove and softened by the scatter of cloth and thread, Maria sat by the window and watched a winter come again. Not the first, which had been an abandonment, but a later, kinder winter where she knew the shape of her life. A little bundle of cloth lay in her lap, and beside her Charlie whistled low while he pounded a peg for a new saddle. The horse in the corral tossed its head in the sun. Snow would come again. It might sting and make promises brittle. But there was also the other kind of coming, a hand offered on a platform, a bowl set on a table, a stitch that held when everything else wanted to tear. And on a quiet evening near Christmas, when the lamp was lit and the house smelled of broth and hope, Maria thought of that first night on the station, of the cold and the suitcase and the way the world had pressed close. She thought of the letter that had promised respectability, and of the other letter she might have written but did not. She thought, too, of the small carved horse on the windowsill, its wooden flank smoothed by hands who had carried it. There was gratitude in the way she folded her fingers around the thimble. Gratitude and a calm knowledge that the heart's home is not sold in a neat package, but earned in the steady work of being present, of choosing another's quiet goodness over glitter that dazzles and then breaks. If you enjoyed the warmth of Maria and Charlie's story, please like and subscribe to keep more Frontier Tales coming. Share a thought in the comments if this one touched you. Your voice keeps these small lives from slipping into the cold. The child slept with a bit of thread caught at the corner of a small fist, as if some invisible seam had kept her tucked inside the night. Maria smoothed the blanket and let the light of the lamp fall along the curve of the child's cheek. Charlie's steps came soft from the back room. He paused in the doorway to look at them both, his face unguarded in the way it was when he thought no one could see the shape of his contentment. "She's a connoisseur of knots," he said, without moving his lips much, a private joke for the two of them. Maria smiled and remembered the first stitches she had taught the child. How tiny the fingers had seemed, how clumsy the loops. Even the small things grew steady with time. Days marked themselves by work and small courtesy. They rose with the light and ate with the light. Maria's hands kept to the rhythm of the house. Bread that rose slow under a cloth, shirts patched at the elbows, a calico dress mended and pressed again for the market. Charlie left early to mend fences and returned late with stories of a mule that refused to yield and the way a colt finally learned to trust a saddle. Life made no pretense at grandeur. It had the rough honesty of tools that are used and repaired and used again. San Luis itself seemed to gather its life out of simple usages. Neighbors dropped by with preserves or to borrow a drill bit and left with coffee and a few shared minutes. There were no grand proclamations of kinship. Everything was quieter, an exchange of labor, an errand run for an old woman whose knees had failed her, a child taught to mind the hen house. It pleased Maria that the town's kindness was not theatrical. It was the kind of generosity that leaves the giver almost invisible. In summer, the valley smelled of crushed grass, and the dust of the road grew fine as flour on the boots. Maria took to walking into town with a bundle of embroidered shirts and a small satchel of lace collars she had fashioned in the slow hours. People came to her not simply for the garments, but for the steadiness of her work, the way a hem did not fray and a seam did not betray its maker. She sold enough to buy medicine when the colic took something from the barn, or to pay for coal in the early springs when frost surprised them. One afternoon, as she was arranging a pile of collars beneath the awning of the general store, a man stepped off the stagecoach and into the square. He had the bearing of someone who traveled on purpose. His jacket was new enough to suggest a city tailor. His paper held a seal of a company whose name Maria had only heard of in passing, as one hears of storms. He moved with a polite gravity and set his hat on the counter. "Good day," he said to the merchant, eyes sweeping the square, catching the sun on the edges of things. "I seek the council or one of the principal landlords. I represent a company looking to buy property in this county for the railroad expansion. We offer fair compensation." At the mention of the railroad, a murmur went through the small place, as if someone had rubbed a damp hand across a sleeping pane. The railroad was a thing that promised, to some, convenience and money. To others, a dismantling of old ways. It carried with it the idea of places rearranged and lines redrawn. Charlie, who had been at the corral, arrived in time to hear the end of the man's explanation. He wiped his hands on his pants, looked at Maria, then at the man. "We're not selling," he said, before the man could finish. His voice carried the simple authority of one who knew his own land. The agent inclined his head. "My offer stands. We aim to lay track through the valley in a matter of seasons. The government will bless what follows. Land values will rise. You'll be compensated." Many in the square were tempted by numbers that sounded round and problem-solving. Debts settled, a roof replaced without the slow thrift of saving, a farm that could be rented out while one sought easier work in town. Others, like Charlie, could see a different ledger. The loss of a fence line that had been their boundary for years, fields where the corn would no longer catch the same light, neighbors moved off into places less like home. The agent promised more, a new store, a larger depot, the sort of commerce that could bring more people to San Luis. He smiled, the sharp smile of men who moved things the way wind moves papers. He did not understand, or did not care to understand, the particular geometry of a life measured in handbreadths of earth and the shape of a day. Councils were not convened in city halls. A meeting gathered at the church threshold that evening, under lamplight and a thin winter when the dark came early. The bell was rung because it had always been rung to call the town for any matter that needed a whole community's attention. Men and women found seats on the weathered benches. Some had driven in from the outlying ranches. Others came with infants slung in shawls. The agent sat with his hands folded, the only figure in the room who did not look exhausted from the day's labor. Voices rose, some practical, some fearful. The agent repeated compensation schedules as if more numbers would make the choice easier. One neighbor spoke of children who would have better schooling on the other side of such development. Another spoke of the stray dogs that would multiply around a new depot, of the way the town's quiet would be eaten by passengers who had no stake in its future. There were arguments over what the word progress ought to mean when other people's houses were the cost. Maria kept quiet until there was a space in the debate. She had never been a woman to take the floor in a loud dispute. When she rose, it was the gentlest motion. Her hands were still smelling faintly of starch from the collars she had ironed that afternoon. "I don't know much of the numbers you offer," she said, "but I know that when a place is bought for something it did not ask for, the thing that lived there is not always what the price covers." Her voice was thin at first, then steadied by what she had learned to say when she mended more than cloth, when she mended a conversation or a hurt. She spoke of the way neighbors trade favors without recording them, how a fence post is not just a stick, but a meeting place where one leaves tools and a note. She told, simply, of the carved horse that sat on their window, how it had been made by a man who had been passing through and who left it behind when he favored them with a small repair and a story. "It is not worth much," she said, "but it remembers hands." The room listened. Even the agent's smile softened. There was no flourish in Maria's words, no melodrama, only the plain insistence that a home was composed of small remembered things, not always of the tidy sums that attended the ledgerman's promises. When the vote was taken, it was not unanimous. Some neighbors, driven by debts or the hope of easier schooling for their sons, chose to entertain the offers. But a strong, steady majority balked at being moved as if they were a crop to be harvested. They would, the town decided, negotiate if they must, but they would not simply surrender their land to an idea. The agent left with letters and promises to return with a more detailed plan. He had expected applause or a swift yes. He left with the peculiar expression of a man whose map had lost some of its lines. In the months that followed, the town settled into a cautious watchfulness. The men and women of San Luis began making small repairs, as if to reinforce more than timber. Fences were mended with extra care, cellar doors were relaid, barns painted with the quiet industry of people who did not plan to abandon their work. Maria could not stop the world from offering its bargains, but she could teach the child to fold a hem so it would last. She taught by setting small tasks, how to press a collar so it did not wrinkle in the wash, how to knot thread so it did not come undone. The lessons were practical and also quietly moral, an education in tending. One afternoon, when the valley itself seemed to hold a long breath under a dry spell, a widow came with a request. Her name was Senora Perez. Her roof leaked in one corner when the rains fell, and she had come with a question of whether Maria could help patch the torn tarpaulin until spring brought better work. Maria tied the tarpaulin with stitches borrowed from her lace, and the woman wept in a way that had nothing to do with pity, tears that were relief at being seen. "You keep on giving people their days back," the widow said, pressing the repaired fabric to her chest as if it were a talisman. "How do you do it?" Maria thought of the letter she had once considered writing, of the false promise of a man who promised to fix what was broken by making it someone else's problem. "I don't fix people," she said. "I help them make what they have hold." It was not a lesson taught in loud words. It was taught by the steady, precise work of hands that had learned to trust the slow accumulation of small goods. The child, Sophia they called her more and more, learned to count with buttons, to read with the labels of bolts of cloth, to find the seam of a shirt by touch when the lights were low. She grew less afraid of being clumsy and more proud of patient work. She watched Charlie teach the colt to stand still beneath a saddle, the gentleness of his corrections, and took from him an idea of strength that did not. At night, when the stove warmed the house and voices softened, Maria would sometimes say the names of things she wanted to remember. She named the places where kindness had been found, the woman at the livery who had offered a bowl, the boy who had traded a bag of corn for a mended collar, the neighbor who had loaned a ladder and then carried it back the next day without being asked. These enumerations were a liturgy of ordinary gratitude. Seasons turned as they will, almost indifferently to the small moralities of persons. The railroad men returned with maps redrawn and offers increased. They met with some who were tempted and with others who were certain. San Luis continued to be a place of practical decisions and unostentatious courage. There were harvests that were lean and winters that demanded all hands. There were days when the stove smoked and the sky threatened. Through it all, Maria's stitching held. And in the middle of one late autumn, when the light had the slow gold of a lamp, a letter, one of those slender official envelopes wrapped in the dust of travel, arrived for her. It bore a hand she recognized from years before, a looping signature that had once seemed final and binding. Her heart tapped a short, quick rhythm at the sight of it. For a moment she wondered if the past had come to demand the present as its due. Charlie stood beside her at the table while she slit the paper with careful fingers. The house smelled of stew and wood smoke. He watched her as if he were looking at a map and trying to orient himself to some new contour. The letter was brief. It did not demand anything. It offered, in small, careful sentences, an apology that might have been written by a man with old wounds as company. He wrote of sorrow, of wandering, of having seen what a life with its promises kept could look like from afar. He asked awkwardly if Maria would forgive him and if he might see the child, perhaps to make amends. Maria read each line twice. She felt once again that seam being straightened in her chest, the same quiet force that had made honesty between her and Charlie. There was no theatrical rage or sudden reconciliation. She folded the letter so that the ends met in the middle and set it aside where the lamp's light would keep it from being lost in the night. "Do you want me to burn it?" Charlie asked, his voice careful, because there are questions that are not only about paper, but about whether the past may be allowed to stand on the porch of the present and call for admission. "No," Maria said, "I will not burn what has been sent. But I will not open the house to everything that asks for admission." Her answer was a small governance, a measure of how they would live.
mercy held.
In the hand, boundaries kept. The seasons rounded toward another winter. Work remained, in all its forms, the way people measured their days. The telegraph, which had come as a thing to some towns and not yet to others, was spoken of in town as if it were something heard in the distance, like thunder. San Luis kept to its ordinary work, and within the ordinary there flourished a stubborn tenderness. At night, when the lamp was low and the child breathed slow, Maria would sometimes pick up the little carved horse and set it beside the lamp. It had small chips and a polished flank where a hand had rubbed it many times. She ran her thumb along its mane and thought of journeys made and decisions chosen. The house around her held the warmth of food and the quiet proof of hands that carried on. There would be more days of difficulty and more offers from men with promises in their pockets. There would be moments when the town would be tempted by easier paths, and moments when they would reach for the slow, steadier ones. Maria knew, in the careful way one learns to carry a bowl without spilling, that the life she had chosen with Charlie was not an escape from suffering, but an arrangement with it, to meet it with a presence that would not be dazzled by quick fixes. She had, by then, learned to name the difference between a thing that wanted to fix her and a life that would walk beside her. The first wanted the quick repair. The second wanted to learn the shape of a life, to press a sleeve and be there the next morning when the seam needed reinforcement. The carved horse seemed to agree when she set it down by the lamp. It sat fixed, simple, a small witness to the work of hands and to the kind of love that grows by habit rather than by spectacle. Outside, the valley took its winter as it always had, with the slow, impartial grace of weather. Inside, the house held its own small, stubborn summer made of bread and stitches and the smell of stew. And somewhere between the folded letter and the carved horse, Maria found a peace that was not the absence of all trouble, but the presence of a faithful order, an ordinary arranging of days, so that they could carry each other, come what might. Late one evening, when the moon had come up thin and pale, there was a knock at the door. It was not urgent or frantic. It was the sort of slow, deliberate knocking that has been taught by years of knowing how to ask for what one needs without taking it. Charlie opened while Maria stood behind him, the lamp throwing both their shadows long across the floorboards. On the threshold stood the man who had written the letter. He was smaller in the shoulders than she remembered, and the travel had put a salt of gray at his temple. His coat was folded clean. His hands, when he lifted them, were the hands of a man who had learned to carry things lightly. For a moment none of them spoke. The child slept somewhere at the back of the house, breathing soft and regular as a bell. "Maria," he said, and the name came out like a thing he had practiced in 100 lonely nights. He did not try to step past the line of the door. He had not come to cross thresholds uninvited. She held the folded letter in one hand, and in the other the carved horse, which she had taken up without thinking. The horse lived now as an object of custody, and she felt its weight like a small loyalty. "May I speak?" the man asked. Charlie watched him for a long breath, then stepped aside. The house stayed exactly as it was, the stew scent in the air, the lamp with its dim circle, the life stacked in its appointed places. The man came no closer than the path would allow. He spoke slowly, as one counting each stone. "I am sorry," he said. "I have been a poor measure of a promise. I was gone more than I ought to have been. If you will have it, I would like, if you will permit, to see the child, to offer my regret in person." Maria looked at him. The apology had been on paper. Now it asked for a face to be trusted with. She thought of all the small courtesies and of the many denials she had learned to give with neither triumph nor cruelty. This was one of those denials that kept the past honest without letting it live in the house. "You may stand here," she said finally. "You may speak." He bent, not to kneel, but to show the position of a man wanting to be less of a weight. He told the child his name, soft as a whisper, so only the house would hear. He did not ask for the child to be handed. He did not pledge to make up for what was lost in promises of tomorrow. He offered instead the thing he had learned to make, steadiness. He spoke of traveling roads and of how loneliness had taught him to look at what he had left. His voice kept tripping on its own small confessions, but they were honest and thin enough that they could be weighed without tipping the balance of their lives. Charlie kept his hands by his sides. When the man's eyes fell on the carved horse, something like recognition passed through him. The man reached into the pocket of his coat and drew out a small thing wrapped in cloth, a wooden bead worn smooth by many palms. He laid it on the step and did not ask the child to take it. "For when she asks," he said, "for when you
Choose to tell her what you will." Maria accepted the bead with 2 fingers. It was no bargaining chip and no bribe. It was a trivial offering, and therefore the truest kind. An apology made small enough not to ask anything in return. She looked at the man, then at Charlie, then at the house that had been made from their keeping. "You may go," she said. "We will keep what we have made." He bowed his head once, an old and private motion, and then he turned away down the lane. The winter air took him in, and the town swallowed the sound of his footsteps. For a while, Maria remained on the threshold, the lamp painting her face in soft shapes, the bead warm where she cupped it. Later, when the child woke and blinked at the shadow of the room, Maria put the bead beside the carved horse. She sat and watched the 2 small things together, one made by her own hands held tight against the other, a new, imperfect sign of what had been admitted and what had been kept at bay. Charlie fetched more stew, and they ate with the door shut against the cold, and there was among their motions a peace that had been earned more than found. In the mornings that followed, the town kept its ordinary ways. The offers of easier roads still came now and then, men with pockets full of bright plans. Maria listened to them as she had learned to listen, with a calmness that could refuse without bitterness. The letter from that night was folded and put into the drawer where the sewing thread lived. It would be there, a paper companion to a choice. And sometimes in the long evenings she would take it out and smooth it with the same care she had once used on a child's hair. Years rolled on with their small accumulation of bread crusts and mended seams. The carved horse lost another little chip along its flank, and the bead grew familiar in the child's hand. When visitors came, they saw a house that had its own slow light. Not the bright, sudden declaration of new things, but the kind of glow that comes from tending. Maria and Charlie grew older together in the ordinary way, made steady by the appointments of their days and by the kind of love that is visible in the way one sets a place at table and in the way one keeps the lamp cleaned. Sometimes, in that late hour when the valley draws its long breath, Maria would look at the horse and the bead on the shelf. She would think of the man who had come with his apology and gone away with nothing demanded. She would think of the child, who had learned both to hold and to let go. The house kept its small, stubborn summer within its walls, while the wider world moved on as it always had. And in that double motion of keeping and allowing, Maria found again the quiet governance that had first guided her. Mercy, yes, but mercy held with hands that knew their own limits.